Now that you've had a chance to think about the things you find important to incorporate in the intended learning outcomes, let's take a look at how that plays a part in the creation of performance-based assessments. In Module 1, the elemental features of performance-based assessments by Dr. Christopher Garris was introduced. We'll now take a deeper dive into that first step, determining a cogent set of intended learning outcomes. Great word, right? Cogent? I wondered what that word meant, and he clarified to mean clear, logical, coherent, and impactful. This first step is the most important, and it's the most intensive. If the intended learning outcomes are clear and tightly aligned to the standards, then it is far more likely that the performance-based assessment that's created will support students in reaching success on the SOLs as well. So as you think about what we want students to know, understand, and be able to do, those are the intended learning outcomes of our unit of study. We want to consider a number of things, perhaps some things we've not focused on before. We want to think about the content, the cognitive behaviors, the dispositions. In that last piece, the dispositions, we really see a strong connection to the portrait of a graduate attributes. There's some questions to consider at the bottom of the screen that can help teams think about starting this process. As teams work through creating the intended learning outcomes, this is a way to check that you've captured all the essential elements. Are the learning outcomes you have created clear, logical, coherent, and impactful? The reference on the screen can help you make that determination. Teams will start with standards as they develop intended learning outcomes. So to help us understand this process, we'll take a look at this third grade science standard that has parallel standards in middle school and high school science as well. When we think about the idea introduced here in 311, renewable and non-renewable energy sources, what do we want students to know, understand, and be able to do? Take a moment and consider, what would you want students to know, understand, and be able to do as a result of this standard? So as teams work through this process, we can move beyond just the SOL itself and look at the SOL framework, because it gives us more information than the standards alone. It elaborates on the content and skills that are part of the intended learning outcomes. Using the verbs shown on the right-hand side, you can see how the different cognitive levels are implied in the standard. When looking to determine those bigger understandings, it can help to look at the left side of this document as well. Even though it says at the top, for instructor use only, this left side can help spark team dialogue around the question, what is worthy of understanding in this standard? What are the bigger ideas that we want kids to make sense of? For this standard, the idea that non-renewable energy sources can't be replaced speaks to the bigger idea of being a responsible citizen of planet Earth. Even as adults, we want to think about using our resources wisely, so this is a great place to focus as an essential understanding for students as well. To be sure that we're planning rigorous instruction and assessment, we need to think about the cognitive level implied in the standard. To do that, it's important to consider the verbs listed in the standard and what they tell us about the depth of knowledge required for students. Which aspects of the standard are asking students to evaluate or create? That is where we'll focus our performance assessment. Aspects of the standard that are at lower cognitive levels can be easily assessed with traditional assessments like tests and quizzes. In addition, we want to ensure that we're creating a rigorous and relevant set of intended learning outcomes that's worthy of creating a performance task for. It would be a good idea to take a look at Standard 3.1, a standard about the nature of science intended to be integrated with other standards throughout the year. It captures the idea of the work of scientists. It can add relevance and authenticity. We mentioned up front this step was the most intensive. And there's one more part we want to keep in mind as we create intended learning outcomes, those portrait of a graduate attributes. As we consider the outcomes for our students that are outlined in the portrait of a graduate, we want to find ways to measure our progress toward those outcomes so we can incorporate them more intentionally into our performance-based assessments as well. Not that you'd incorporate all 5 of them into your intended learning outcomes. You'd pick one that most naturally lends itself to the standard you're working with. We have a feeling that you probably are already incorporating these attributes into the work that you're doing. We now just want to be more intentional and explicit about naming that and highlighting it so that we can be sure that we are instructing and assessing for students to meet these goals. This is an example of one team's intended learning outcomes for Standard 311. They took those intended learning outcomes, looked at the level and depth according to Bloom's taxonomy, and made the determination to create a 25-question test to address the items on the left side of this grid. They then created a performance-based assessment where it would be most effective for those two evaluation level pieces you see at the bottom. You can see they started with the basics of the standard and then added in the parts that mattered to them and their students, like the third example down, exploring media reports that portray various perspectives, so students have to make some determination about which sources are valid. That piece aligns to critical and creative thinking. The fourth one, resource use in the home, school, and community, was chosen because it made the standard more authentic and because it connected to the Portrait of a Graduate attribute of global citizen. There is a blank copy of this tool available for you and for your team if it could be helpful for you. You'll find it in the module folder. To give you an opportunity to apply your learning from today's module, the duration of your time will be spent completing the following task. We want this experience to be relevant and meaningful to you, so we ask that you choose some specific content that you'll be teaching in an upcoming unit. Select standards and benchmarks to unpack or repack. You might choose to use the unit planning template with guiding questions and your grade level curriculum framework as tools to first identify the KUDs for your unit if you haven't unpacked them before. Then you'll want to think about connections to Portrait of a Graduate. To get credit for this unit, you'll need to locate the intended learning outcome template that can be found in the module folder. Record your ideas and think about which ones you might assess through a performance-based assessment. Once you have completed the intended learning outcome template, we ask that you submit this work through the link provided in the folder to receive credit for completing the module. If you are completing multiple modules in the course, you'll use the intended learning outcomes from this module to continue the process of developing performance-based assessments in subsequent modules. As we wrap up our time together in this module, it's important to stop and self-evaluate, to reflect on today's work. As you review the intended learning outcomes that you created, use the checklist of questions on the screen to self-assess and reflect. These questions can guide you in the process as you move forward with developing intended learning outcomes in the future. Remember, this is a process, and wherever you may be on the continuum of developing outcomes, this module and the resources here can serve as a reference tool to support you and your team's work and your ongoing professional growth. We hope to see you in Module 4.